We'll start the webinar in just a moment. Thank you for logging in, and we'll be starting shortly. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, E-Fueling Flight, How to Increase In-State Production of Electrofuels for Aviation in California and Beyond. My name is Ethan Elkind. I direct the climate program at UC Berkeley Law School Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. And we are a research center based at the law school at UC Berkeley. We develop law and policy solutions to pressing environmental and energy and climate and water challenges, including the challenge of aviation, which is our subject today. And you can see on our screen, we've got a wonderful lineup of speakers today. You're going to hear an overview of our new report, which came out last month, called E-Fueling Flight, How to Increase In-State Production of Electrofuels for Aviation in California and Beyond. That report is on our website. You'll be hearing more about that. We've also got a panel coming up with some wonderful speakers, including Lillian from the California Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, Nick Pavlenko from the International Council on Clean Transportation, and DJ Zaziski, who is Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy at Infinium. And if I can ask my colleague to stop sharing the screen, and we'll go ahead and do a little more intro here. Let's see. There we go. All right. Thank you all. And a couple notes about the discussion today. So we're going to start with a overview of electrofuels or e-fuels, what their potential might be to help power aviation in this hard to decarbonize sector with a carbon neutral fuel, and what states can do to boost deployment in states like primarily California, but we also hope that this will be instructive for folks in other states as well, other jurisdictions, the kind of policies we need to scale up this industry. And then after we hear an overview of the report findings, we'll have this panel discussion. One note on housekeeping, we will be going through the hour, and if you have questions about anything you hear, please do use the Q&A function. Hopefully everyone in this post-COVID era is familiar with the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to your questions. I would note, oftentimes in these webinars, people save all their questions for the last 5 minutes, and we run out of time. So if you have a question and can think of it early and put it in early, we'll be sure to get to it if we can. No promises, but we'll do our best. And sometimes we'll follow up after the fact as well. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce and welcome back our former Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment climate research fellow, CLEE Ferguson-Smith. I say former because she helped put the report out last month, but has just taken up a new position based in London as policy officer at the Global School of Sustainability at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So I know CLEE is coming to us live from the United Kingdom, where I know it's very toasty. So climate change in action, that's why we need electrofuels. And CLEE's going to go ahead and give an overview of the report. So CLEE, take it away, and thank you for coming back to CLEE to provide these comments and overview of the report findings.
Thank you very much, Ethan. It's a pleasure to be here today with everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction. I am indeed connecting live from the London Climate Action Week, where it's quite warm here at the London School of Economics. We're thankful to have AC, which is a rare thing here in London. Anyways, today I want to come back to California, and we're going to try to answer the question of how to increase in-state production of e-fuels for aviation in California and beyond. This is the topic of our new report. I wish to give a brief overview. First, why is aviation a problem? What are e-fuels? I will go into defining what we mean by electrofuels, and go over some of the top barriers to boosting some of this e-fuel production, and of course go over then some of the solutions that we came up with during a convening that we held last year. Some of the panelists on today's webinar were there with us, of course, and some of the recent other clean aviation reports that we have released in the past few years, and then we will go on to a panel discussion with our experts. So aviation accounts for roughly 3% of the world's carbon emissions and is one of the most carbon intensive activities today. And the percentage is growing. Additionally, kerosene jet A fuel currently used in our flights contains aromatic and sulfur, which leads to air pollution and often disproportionately impacts disadvantaged communities that live close to airports. And currently, no zero emission technology exists at a commercially and technologically feasible scale to power all aviation trips and meet long-term demand. So as a result, advocates and policymakers are looking to carbon neutral electrofuels, known as e-fuels, as an option to decarbonize long distance flights and an alternative to the fossil jet fuel that we know of today. Okay, but what are e-fuels? E-fuels are synthetic petroleum chemically created by combining zero-emission hydrogen produced from carbon-free power like wind or solar energy and captured carbon dioxide. So there are three feedstocks here: zero-emission hydrogen, carbon-free power, and carbon dioxide. This fuel burns like traditional petroleum and existing gas turbines engines, therefore requiring no major modification to planes for much of the existing fueling infrastructure. But significant economic and policy barriers are preventing large-scale investment in and deployment of e-fuel production technology, which we highlighted in our report. So we came up with three barriers. The first one being a high capital and production cost. We can think of the cost for direct air capture, for example. There's a lack of demand by airlines for e-fuels, and regulatory and permitting challenges to building e-fuel production in production plants and infrastructure. So the solutions that we came up with at the convening and have drawn up in our report, there are about 18 solutions. I will only give a couple examples within three buckets. The first one being increased state support for in-state fuel production. Here, for instance, the legislature in California or the California Air Resources Board, for instance, could develop loan guarantee programs for e-fuel projects to leverage the state's cap and invest proceeds, or formerly known as cap and trade. Another solution could be the legislature could create a state-level production tax credit for e-fuels. That's two examples within this first bucket. Second bucket is a support and require e-fuel procurement. Here, the legislature in California could support e-fuel offtake agreements through guarantee revenue certainty mechanisms. For instance, contract for difference program. That's one example. And then in the third bucket of solutions, they could coordinate regulatory and permitting reform in California. The legislature here, maybe with the governor's office, could develop a long-term aviation decarbonization industrial plan and designate e-fuel zones, for instance, for production with incentives for facilities that locate within them. So these are some of the solutions that we came up with in our report. We encourage you to read it. And of course, we have also other reports that we released in the last few years from our center in collaboration also with other local groups such as Arches. And my last point here before I give the floor back to Ethan is this research is important and it matters because unless policymakers and industry take action, aviation will continue to grow, and its carbon pollution and well, impact, carbon impact and significant pollution. Um, and given the potentially long-term horizon to deploy e-fuel technology at scale to lower costs, along with potential co-benefits to other hard-to-abate sectors that we haven't really mentioned here today, such as maritime shipping, policymakers would benefit from starting today or now. So please read our reports after the webinar and check it out. You could, with the link of the QR code, and I will give it over to, hand it over to Ethan for a presentation and introduction of our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for that excellent overview of the issue, what e-fuels are, some of the solutions that we talk about in the report, and just your last point about how important it is that policymakers start to take action right away. I also just want to acknowledge Chloe as lead author on this report, did a bang-up job, and we will miss you as you're over in the UK, but happy for you to move on to exciting new things. I also just want to acknowledge Climate Works Foundation provided some really critical support for this work. So I also want to just thank Anna Stratton over there and Kanchi Gupta for their support for this work. And Chloe's going to be sticking around with our panel. So if you have questions about the report specifically, Chloe will be available to answer questions and potentially field some questions to our panelists as well. So now, without further ado, I do want to welcome our three panelists for the remainder of this hour. Again, want to let folks tuning in know that you can ask any questions as this panel unfolds using the Q&A function. I'll introduce them one by one. I have a question for each of them. So I'm going to start by introducing Lillian Liu, who is Program Manager of Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Market Development at the California Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, abbreviated as GO-Biz, which I do believe is the best acronym in state government. I'm not just saying that because you're on the call, Lillian, but I mean, let's be honest, GO-Biz is pretty cool.
It's pretty great.
At GO-Biz, Lillian focuses on aligning state governments' efforts to justly scale renewable clean hydrogen and collaborating with cross-sector partners to decrease barriers to hydrogen technology deployment. And as you just heard, hydrogen is a key ingredient for e-fuels. She previously served as an Environmental Defense Fund Climate Corps Fellow at the U.S. General Services Administration and also served as a Jesse Unruh Assembly Fellow in the California State Legislature. So Lillian, welcome to the webinar. And my first question for you is if you can just describe from your perspective in state government what you see as the sort of the upside, the opportunities and the benefits that e-fuels could bring to California specifically, and potentially to other states too, for those listening from out of state.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. Thank you for having me on. It's been such a great process being part of this, convening with CLEE. You all did such a great job hosting and writing this report. And yeah, so, this is a huge opportunity for the state of California. Jet fuel demand in the state is increasing from roughly 260 tons per day in 2023 up towards 350 tons per day by 2045. And as Chloe mentioned, it takes a lot of coordination to scale this in a way that is ensuring that we're also going to meet our carbon neutrality goals by 2045. As you know, California has within laws our ambitious carbon neutrality goals, and we'll continue to see through various state mechanisms and planning documents such as the scoping plan, our SB 1075 report, our hydrogen market development strategy, how we coalesce our various incentives to move towards direction of accomplishing this. And as you all know, right, this adopting e-fuels not only helps scale decarbonization and lower carbon fuels for the aviation sector, but it also co-benefits other sectors as well. So by coming up with solutions for decarbonizing aviation, we are also helping, provide more of the feedstock that helps decarbonize maritime and also even potentially ammonia for in-state like or fertilizer production as well. As you know, there's a lot of geopolitical issues going on impacting the pricing of our fuels and energy sources. So this is one way that California and many other states can all kind of be on the path towards more secure supply of these fuels and also being on the way towards meeting our carbon neutrality goals.
Yeah, such a great point that, we're obviously focused on aviation today, but the co-benefits, the other sectors, Chloe had mentioned maritime as well, fertilizer production, if we can really scale up carbon capture, hydrogen, zero emission hydrogen, get the renewable electricity deployment going, we can potentially decarbonize a whole range of hard to abate sectors. So yeah, thank you for that. And now I'm going to ask the same question to our next speaker here, Nikita Pavlenko, who is Programs Director for Fuels and Aviation at the International Council on Clean Transportation, or ICCT. Also, along with Lillian and DJ, our third panelist, participant at the convening that helped inform this report. Nick is focused on the techno-economics and climate implications of alternative fuels, as well as the policy interventions needed to support the commercialization and deployment of these advanced ultra-low carbon fuels. Prior to ICCT, he supported work at EPA on life cycle material management models and waste reduction models, and received his BA in environmental studies from Yale University. Nick, same question for you. What do you see as a sort of upside here in deploying e-fuels?
Sure. So I would say that California is in a bit of a unique situation. With respect to the opportunity for producing e-fuels, California is the state where there's the biggest mix of potential incentives and opportunities to get additional market value for selling e-fuels. You can lean in on policies like the low carbon fuel standard and get more value for the fuels you produce. But I would also caution that in that it's also a state where it might be more challenging to produce e-fuels as well. It's a state where the costs of construction, the costs of electricity may be higher than in some other parts of the country. So this points to some of the challenges associated with deployment. It's about finding a location where you have cheap electricity, but also electricity that's renewable and highly available over the course of the day, and trying to match that to the where you can get a lot of incentives. At its core, e-fuel production can be a bit of a inefficient process. So it's about driving down the cost of production through good siting of the facility, but then also finding opportunities to get additional value for the fuel you're selling. Jet fuel, fossil jet fuel is quite cheap on the market, current crisis aside. And so you're competing for the most part against a very cheap product. So policies like the LCFS in California really do make a difference.
I think it's such a great point. We've got the sort of political ambition and laws on the books in California to help advance things like e-fuels, but the economics are, more challenging in the state in many ways, which I think leads nicely to hear from our third panelist here, David DJ Zaziski, Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy at Infinium, which is an e-fuels producer. David drives Infinium's public policy, regulatory strategy, and government relations, and works on promoting e-fuels as a scalable, eco-friendly alternative to traditional fossil liquid fuels. And I have to note that he does have a PhD in chemistry from our university here at UC Berkeley. So always good to bring back a bear onto our webinars here. So yeah, David, I'm curious, your thoughts in particular in response to what Nick was saying about the challenging economics. What will it take, for your company and others like it to be able to scale up in California, and what would you see as the upside?
Well, first off, thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Chloe, for pulling together the report and this dialogue that we're having here. Really, like at a first level, I want to point out really the benefits of e-fuels in terms of what it can deliver. It can deliver deep decarbonization to hard to abate sectors of the transportation. And we're talking about typically 95+% reductions in GHG emissions compared to petroleum fuels. It's well suited for applications of heavy transportation. We talked about airlines. We've talked about diesel trucks, heavy duty trucks. We talked about marine applications. It's a good fitting in terms of the technology match, the needs match, and you produce a cleaner burning fuel for the variety of the molecular reasons that Chloe brought up as well. Look, we're a California company. We're headquartered in California. We've been operating the world's largest and first commercial e-fuels production facility. It's sited in Texas. There's some logical reasons why Texas became an origin point for our facilities. You have permitting, the ability to stand up at a facility that looks like a refinery, although it's one that has zero emissions, which is a little off the paradigm. But as you can appreciate, building things in California is difficult from regulations like CEQA and the like. Power is certainly a hot topic right now, both in the context of an e-fuel producer. Obviously, price is important, but your interconnect to the grid and the time to get interconnected is important as part of things. And then as you think about it, supportive policies that embrace e-fuels are important. And I'm sure we'll get into it today, there's steps that CARB could take to make eligibility in programs like the LCFS program and other incentives basis that are compatible and allow e-fuels to be eligible would go a long way to flipping that equation and addressing consideration so California can otherwise stand up new facilities. And I'll just lead, I think we all know the challenges in California. You know, we have 7 operating refineries today. E-fuels facility offers a pathway to expand on an infrastructure, job creation and the like, but also give more integrity to having more facilities operating. So if one goes down, we don't see it at the pump, a week later with the prices going skyrocketing up. And so there's more resilience, which benefits us as consumers. It benefits the infrastructure and the state as well.
Yeah, it does. I mean, some of these problems around refinery closures, predate, our report, but, definitely the last few months have really underscored the sort of energy and economic security benefits of having more in-state production of the fuels that we need for these sectors like aviation, where we don't have batteries, for example, that can solve the problem for us, like with on-road transportation. Well, all three of you really helped elucidate not just the benefits but some of the challenges, particularly on the higher costs of all the sort of ingredients for e-fuels and the competition with fossil jet fuel. So we have economic challenges, we have permitting challenges. I'm curious to hear from each of you, kind of what are the key solutions that you're either working on or would like to see implemented. And Lillian, I'll go back to you for that, for what GO-Biz is focused on, and anything else you're kind of free to discuss on the policy wish list.
Yeah, of course. In terms of solutions, we're constantly in talks with various businesses from across the hydrogen value chain, which also includes like e-fuels producers, right? As offtake of this feedstock and also the broader market. What are the market mechanisms that we have yet to explore as the state of California? Chloe had listed a few, and you can read more in the report. And also at GO-Biz, we lead the California Jobs First Economic Development Blueprint. And what this does is it sections the state off into 13 different economic development regions and really thinks from the ground up approach of what does like clean economy development look like, and how can you, from a regions up approach, identify places where you can perhaps develop zones that for e-fuels. And of course, we're seeing this trend in all different types of decarbonization pathways, like clean freight zones. But the principle within this is how can you pre-identify, working close with regions and local stakeholders and local jurisdictions. And of course, the state has a integrating role with all this to work together and find places where you have faster permitting, perhaps even defined upfront what the expectations are. And right, the cost of power is so critically high. how might some predefined or a menu of possibilities to figure out what a special tariff could look like within such a zone that could help e-fuels production or even any other type of clean industrial development, and make sure that this helps contribute to that local regional economic and job, like high road jobs and careers within the state of California. Those are all exciting opportunities that I would love to continue to see to grow and expand with our jobs first efforts. Another thing I will mention is that GO-Biz, we provide assistance with permitting, and one of this ways that we do it is actually by publishing a hydrogen permitting guidebook. We also have a clean energy permitting guidebook, which touches more on the solar, battery, and wind side of things. And what it does is really try to democratize this information of navigating the oftentimes difficult and heavily nuanced permitting environment across the state. Of course, every region will have slight nuances from place to place, but really this is designed to be a tool so that developers and also jurisdictions like permitting officials and fire marshals alike can all turn to as a guide for best practices. And this is also a way to, right, if you have questions, like you can turn to there. And also, of course, you can reach out to GO-Biz at any point, because this is really our bread and butter of helping with site selection services and offering that permitting support.
Yes, I know this is a big thing that GoBiz tackles, and just to underscore in our report, we also talked about the need for the state to set aside what we call e-fuel zones, areas where you can essentially get all the permitting done in advance, so projects can just come right in, and hopefully eliminate some of the sort of transaction costs and permitting challenges. Nick, curious to hear from your perspective. What do you think are some of the key policy needs? You did mention the low carbon fuel standard. Not sure if all of our participants are familiar with that. So maybe if that's something you want to talk about, just provide a little bit of an overview of how that works now, along with anything else. You don't have to say that as your preferred policy, but yeah, a little information would be great.
Yeah, thanks for queuing that up. I would say it's not my preferred policy, but it's one area in which California is a bit ahead of most of the rest of the country, where due to the risk of federal preemption, California doesn't obligate alternative aviation fuels, but it allows them to opt into existing road sector policies. So, in the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, a GHG intensity standard for alternative fuels in the road sector, uh, producers of SAFs can opt in and get an incentive based on the GHG reduction of their fuel. Now, this incentive is proportional to the GHG reduction, and so in principle, e-fuels can get a large incentive. But I don't think the LCFS is really enough to move the market on its own. As I alluded to earlier, this is an expensive, challenging technology, but still worth pursuing. It's really challenging to scale up biomass to meet the combined needs of aviation and maritime. So, even if it's an expensive technology, and there's going to be a cost premium over conventional fuel for the foreseeable future, you need some kind of combination of policies to help cover that price gap. Or you need to find a market or an off-taker that's willing to pay more than the cost of fossil jet. And that can be, driven by demand side policies like mandates that obligate airlines or fuel suppliers to blend fuels, things like the LCFS. Or it can be supply side policies that subsidize the cost difference or some combination of the two. At ICCT, a lot of our work is in Europe, where we have e-fuel mandates on the books actually in aviation, which is a very different conversation than we have here in the States. And that's all well and good, but what we're seeing there is that these mandates are at risk. Um, Very few, if any, e-fuel producers in the EU have gotten final investment decision. And so even with really hefty financial penalties on the horizon, these projects are facing difficulties attracting investment. So, why is this happening? A lot of it is due to the perception of investment risk. The project takes a few years to construct. Investors' view of the market is unclear. Do they think the mandate is still going to be on the books in a few years? When is their fuel available to sell, and what's the final price of their production? The process of price exploration is in its really, really early stages for this technology. And so the solution that policymakers are kind of coalescing around in the EU is that of de-risking investment, rather than just subsidizing the fuels or penalizing non-compliance. Can we just stabilize the market price for producers through something called a revenue certainty mechanism? So right now, the EU is focused on designing and implementing that revenue certainty mechanism instrument to provide a bit of a stable price for fuel producers and aggregate demand from airlines to provide stability and get those investors off the sidelines and supporting those facilities. I'll also note that, given all the difficulties in the EU, in the US, we have a bit of a special sauce with our policy mix because some of our policies allow for subsidies for fuel that's produced in the US but not consumed in the US. And so there are some e-fuel startups in the US. They're actually targeting the European market where they see more stable, bigger demand, but still relying on subsidies here.
Thank you, Nick. Really helpful to have that EU perspective because they are farther ahead of us from a policy perspective on this issue. And it does create an opportunity for California to learn and potentially innovate beyond what the European Union is doing. And if policymakers adopted all the recommendations in our report, then that would obviously make us happy and I think would position California well. So we can dream. David, I wanted to ask you, curious your reaction to what Nick was describing and also just what your sort of wish list would be for policies to try to scale up production more locally here.
Oh, sure. Well, first off, it's important to calibrate the role of policy with respect to bringing a new energy technology to bear. I think it's fair to say, and I'll make the bold statement, there hasn't been an energy technology that has been brought into the marketplace that hasn't had a government or policy support at some point in time in terms of an intervention. And as you can appreciate, an incumbent technology that matures, that's existing foothold in the market has driven down. And so there's a premium gap at a new technology, be it from a risk perspective, being it from a scale perspective, economy of scale perspective, et cetera. And so there's a long lineage, and you could go back to, the market of coal. You built the railroads to help move it around. Wind and solars had federal tax support. Ethanol in the early days had federal tax credits, again, to help spur these new industries. And so bear in mind, e-fuels are no different as you bring a new technology to market in a need for there. And also we're pushing the envelope on trying to decarbonize as much as possible. So you see, the 95+% reductions are substantial in terms of its greenhouse gas potential. The policy network in the US is a little bit of a stitchwork. It's today, renewable fuels policy sort of is built on the assumption that you stitch together a number of different policy instruments to be able to help find the financial support to bridge that gap that I just mentioned. At the federal level, there's been components from the IRA and then extended and tweaked and modified in OB3 Act around 45Z tax credit, which is for clean fuels production. E-fuels also intersects other tax credits, including hydrogen as an input. So that's 45V, the clean hydrogen tax credit. You also use captured carbon dioxide in the process, which is section 45Q as part of the tax code. And then certainly electricity, renewable electricity input, there's tax credits around wind and solar. And so those are a piece of the mix to help, bridge that financial gap. States can also play a role. And again, while one credit may not be that supersized, as you keep adding to it, it helps that stack of incentives to bridge that gap. So California has several opportunities One which is already built in, as we mentioned, the low carbon fuel program. The perennial hurdle there, as the program has been put together and engineered and designed, there's components that don't make it compatible with how we produce e-fuels. Use of renewable electricity, the bulk of it comes through the grid as part of it. And so aligning the LCFS program to allow the use of renewables over the grid as part of the calculation of determining your greenhouse gas footprint would enable and open up the LCFS program. There's also been more discussions recently in the legislature and the governor's office around targeted tax credits, like for production of SAF. Again, this can all help in that financial stack to make the numbers work, if you will, in that context. So I gave you two examples at the state side, but really kind of matching it compatibly with also available federal incentives. I'll also add on the federal side, RFS program, which was built around renewable fuels derived from biomass, needs some definitional changes, but could also unlock it. So there's opportunities on a number of fronts here to interject e-fuels, which weren't sort of thought, it wasn't contemplated when these policy instruments were put in place. And so it's refreshing and modernizing them for the new technology innovations that we're seeing today.
Yeah, DJ, I'm glad you brought up the federal tax credits in particular, because that was going to be the question. One of the questions I was going to ask about what federal tax credits have survived. And we did go through in the report those same credits. So if anyone, didn't get to jot down all the 45 V's and Z's and everything else, the link in the report is in the chat there, and we go through those. So appreciate that, as well as the commentary on what the state could be doing. Low carbon fuel standard, we also talk about the need for the Air Resources Board to properly credit the inputs to e-fuels so that they get recognized for their, objectively low carbon benefits that they're bringing. Just going to be a little hard to track since you have so many different sort of low carbon feedstocks or zero carbon feedstocks going into e-fuels. So we have a bunch of great questions here from our audience, and I do want to encourage folks to use the Q&A function if you have more questions. I want to start with a question from Breck about the health consequences of our sort of current aviation fuels and the potential new aviation fuels like e-fuels. Chloe, I know this is something that we touched on in the report a little bit, not in a huge amount of depth, but do you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. We didn't, this was a little bit out of scope in terms of comparing, and actually there weren't, to my knowledge, there isn't very much research on this yet, comparing and contrasting the different types in terms of the health consequences. Of course, we do touch upon a little bit of the health consequences of current kerosene on page 12 of the reports. So please check it out, please. And then lots of footnotes or endnotes. I see Nick has his hand up, and he may know a little bit more than me on this compare and contrast parts. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in because this is like something new we're working on that I was really excited to share. So there are some really compelling health implications for SAFs generally, also e-fuels, just on the basis of their lower aromatic content than conventional fuels. They also are sulfur free, and so that means lower air quality impacts, ground level sulfur, ultrafine particles around airports that affect nearby communities and airport workers as the blend level for fuels goes up. Now, granted, we would expect very low blend levels in the near to medium term, but there are some really compelling air quality benefits as SAFs are deployed in greater volumes.
Could you actually, you said SAF, and I think I purposefully did not talk about sustainable aviation fuels. Nick, maybe could you explain the kind of the main difference or e-fuels versus SAF to the webinar participants?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Here I was just referring to SAF as alternative aviation fuels, of which e-fuels are just one of the many varieties.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm curious, I don't know, DJ, if this comes up at all in, sort of any community-based discussions, or as you're trying to, talk to policymakers around e-fuels, is health an argument that public health benefits of transition to e-fuels, an argument you'll make, or any data you cite along those lines?
It's certainly an argument we bring up. I think we're looking forward to seeing more concrete studies around it. There's more work that needs to be studied. I know NASA has done some work. There's been a small number of initiatives on it. And look, I'm a chemist. Aromatics and sulfur through combustion process lead to these air pollutants. And if you don't have them up front in the fuels, you're not going to have them coming out the back end of the plane. And so there's a natural fit. Now we need more research to understand the numerical differences, including down to nuances that things like contrails and so forth, which have other implications in terms of our air quality and air effects as part of it. And so I think we're at the cusp to be able to start doing that as these fuels come into the market, get used, and we can start seeing those measurable impacts grow over time in that respect. I think the challenging part is the policy instruments today haven't everything focuses and revolves around greenhouse gas reductions. And so those other aspects of the air quality benefits aren't reflected in the policy instruments. And so there's probably a bit of learning on the policy side to try to connect those dots too, which will just help us get to more of these types of fuels, which will then harvest more of these advantages for everyone.
Yeah, I think it doesn't quite get as much attention as it probably should, that it's often, disadvantaged communities of color located around airports that are, disproportionately getting the negative impacts, the pollution from aircraft, not to mention the refineries from the fossil fuels, and that disadvantaged communities located around those facilities as well, both of which sources of pollution e-fuels could help address. Um, so I want to take another question here. We have two related questions, one from Amra and the other from Larry. Uh, First question is around, do we have enough clean electricity? Will we have enough clean electricity to produce e-fuels given the state's existing electrification priorities like EVs and all electric buildings? Plus, we need to just fully decarbonize our grid anyways. Larry sort of adds on to this just about the material resources and land needed for construction. So really, just do we have enough of the sort of inputs here in California to meet our demand? And I'm curious if any of you have thoughts in response to that. And Nick, I think this is something you've sort of looked at to some extent. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to kick it off in response to these questions.
Yeah, I think this is an important question, and it has a lot to do with where you site your e-fuels and how quickly you ramp up the process. I think the concern about electricity availability is very real, very valid, and very important, particularly due to the fact that e-fuel production is very energy inefficient. You're converting the electricity into hydrogen and then into a liquid fuel, losing energy at the different steps in the process. This is then compounded by the fact that e-fuel is something where you're looking for a lot of electricity availability, not just in absolute quantities, but throughout the day. Even if you have very cheap electricity, say, California at about, noon, it's often more optimal to look for a place that has renewables throughout the day. Maybe at a location where sunshine is supplemented by wind in the evening, perhaps Texas, perhaps the Great Plains. And so all of those are going to be factors that play into where it makes sense to develop an e-fuel project.
Yeah, I'm curious, Lillian, if this is something that comes up in your role in state government. It's obviously other state policies that are encouraging electrification of on-road transportation and buildings and renewable electricity deployment. Just curious your perspective on this issue around specifically electricity availability, but also as I mentioned, there's a question around just, availability for hydrogen and captured carbon, all of it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say our sister agencies are looking into this and studying this frequently, especially on the electricity availability, right? The Energy Commission has the IPER, which is the Integrated Energy Policy Report. So you can actually go on their website and see the 2025 draft, which is available. There's demand forecasts for electricity demand or even hydrogen demand. And of course, all models are wrong and some are useful. We try to be as useful as possible, right? Demand estimations or any type of modeling estimations are subject to change based on how policy environments shift and what has or has not happened with federal incentives or even state incentives and the funding available. But I would say that is the best place or resource to turn to. And also, I will say that California Air Resources Board has the SB 1075 report, which is a comprehensive study of the production and use of and distribution of hydrogen. And aviation is certainly one of those, end use pathways. So there will be some information that's likely in there, or at least like in the technical reports backing up that report once it's ready to share. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. Helpful resources. And DJ, I'm curious if also if this comes up and, do you have to compete for renewable electricity? How do you kind of envision the future on this? And I would know we got another question from Melvin, kind of along these lines, just around the competition now from data centers due to, increased use of AI. How big of a factor is this for companies like yours?
Yeah, so first off, it's a great question. I think as you look towards e-fuel projects, we look towards bringing on additional renewable electricity. So as part of our projects is to ensure that there's renewables backing behind that. In most cases, we're producing more than we need, so we tender that off to the grid, and so that actually helps contribute. The flip side is, or in addition to that, rather, there's also an opportunity to help balance the grid out as renewables grow in percentage on the grid. And California, obviously, is a leader towards pushing renewable electricity. There's times where energy is curtailed, and so as a consumer, you have the opportunity, as a meaningful consumer of electricity, have the opportunity to harvest that wasted, underutilized resource through power curtailment in this context. So I think the short answer is it can be done sort of in a productive way, bringing onto the grid, both contributing and then also leveraging and better optimizing the electricity usage within the grid environment. I think on your last question with respect to data centers and AI, I will say, getting interconnects onto the grid, there's always a long laundry list. So this is everything from getting your renewable facility connected to the grid, but also you as a consumer getting attached to the grid. Unfortunately, it has been taking a lot longer because there's a lot of other data centers, hyperscalers, et cetera, that find themselves in the queue in great numbers. And so balancing that, there's really an opportunity from various power authorities to manage that process rationally in a way that also meets the timelines that we need to be able to bring decarbonization technologies to market so that we can meet our climate goals.
And David, just to stay with you for a second, I'm also curious about the economics or upside or not of just essentially having your own off-grid renewable facility. Would it make sense for e-fuel producers to just build their own renewable facilities, not be dependent on the grid, given where costs are going and where battery technology, other storage technology is going? Or does that not feel like it really makes sense economically?
It's a tough one because what you're asking the e-fuel producer to not only be a fuel producer, but to effectively be a utility and also a balancing authority. And you're doing that with a small number of assets. I would actually argue that our utilities and balancing authorities are better servicing that model because A, it's their business, but they also do it on a wider scale. They'll have thousands of different assets. And more importantly, we'll have assets on Northern California, some on the coast, some in Central and you have a distribution of different production profiles that they're able to meld and match more effectively than saying the fuel producer, you have to provide, you have to, I guess, bring your own bring your own electricity is probably an acronym for that in that context. So I think more ideally, I think let the fuel producers do the fuel production, find policies for the utilities and balancing authorities to drive decarbonization and do that match will be a lot more efficient for everyone overall.
All right. So no BYORE, bring your own electricity.
Yes, there you go.
And you're the one who came up with that. I'm not claiming credit. So Lillian, earlier, I think one of the speakers here mentioned the governor's proposed SAF tax credit doesn't affect e-fuels, as far as I understand. Curious if you could just maybe outline what's in that proposal and what would have to change for it to benefit e-fuels.
Yeah, totally. As written today, it does not, as you mentioned, benefit e-fuels. So the language that is written for that tax credit in California really requires that SAF be a drop-in fuel and to be LCFS eligible. So based on what is eligible within LCFS today, that is just HEFA SAF, which is hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. And so really right within LCFS, there are various pathways that need to be developed. And also the methodology. And so I think, as David had mentioned previously, that in order for e-fuels to be reflected within our existing incentive mechanisms, it would have to be adapted and custom fit to how e-fuels producers and operate and build their business model to actually produce within the state.
Yeah, thanks for that overview, Lillian. Nick, DJ, curious if there's anything you wanted to add on the tax credit proposal.
I'm happy to jump in. I'm really clued into different staff tax credits and states. There's a lot to like about the California one. There's some very mediocre ones in other states. I don't want to get into the details. But I think there are also some critical problems here. I think in terms of the eligibility, what counts as a SAF, I think California gets it right. It should be possible for a pathway to be approved under the LCFS from an e-fuel producer, no problem. It might be time consuming, but the framework is there for it to not only qualify, but be eligible for a large reduction. And then the tax credit is proportional to the GHG savings. So an e-fuel could also qualify for the upper tier of the credit. I would say where it falls short is that in the actual credit structure where the credit is provided against diesel excise taxes. And so here, there's a bit of a difficulty in that very few producers of SAF also have a diesel excise tax to offset.
Yeah, David, anything you want to add?
No, I think you hit Lillian and Nick just hit on the two, I think, structural parts that is missing in the tax credits to be more applicable to e-fuels and similar advanced SAF technologies. That being said, there's blueprints from other states that have enacted this. It's the same policies, and so it's less of a question of how, it's more of a political question of if in that respect.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions that I want to give Nick the first crack at, because you may have done some research on this, Nick, or ICCT in general may have done it. First question from Breck is, what is the added cost per passenger mile driven by the LCFS versus petroleum jet fuel? And I guess this is maybe not a related question, but a question of just, if we were to sort of have a hunch for how much aviation needs could possibly be fueled by e-fuels, if we were to no longer use fossil fuels for aviation, what do we sort of see as the upside here? So two, I guess, different questions. But Nick, I'm curious if you've done any research on this or have any
Sure.
thoughts in response.
Yeah. At the risk of being a bit glib, on the first question, I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier about aviation being an opt-in to the LCFS. It's a bit of a free rider. So the added cost of the LCFS to flyers right now is $0 per passenger mile. It's all upside for SAF producers, no costs for passengers. Now, on this question of what my hunch is for how much aviation fuel can be supplied with e-fuels, I can try and answer this, but I'm also going to ask a few questions in the process because I think this is something that's still wide open. Um, we can look to the EU as a guide where they have e-fuel targets. The UK is in a similar boat out to 2040, out to 2050. They see it as about 1% in 2030 and about a third of aviation fuel by 2050. That 1% target is proving to be very challenging to meet. That has implications for the longer term target. But we can also look to fundamentals to get a sense of, okay, how much fuel would need to be supplied from e-fuels if we're to stay aligned with net zero targets. Um, the EU, other countries only have so much biomass that they can feasibly supply to aviation and maritime. If you're optimistic, perhaps 20 to 50% of energy demand could be met. That leaves a really big gap that could be that would need to be met by e-fuels. But there's also a risk that the sectors are not decarbonized, that they rely on offsets or carbon capture or just pollute in a business as usual scenario.
Yeah. Well, thank you for weighing in on those. We're almost out of time. I'm going to give the rest of you a few seconds each. If you want to respond to that question around what do you see as sort of long-term potential here and any other closing thoughts, you got about 30 seconds each. So Lillian, I'll go to you first off here.
Yeah, well, we got to meet our goals somehow for carbon neutrality, and we know that demand is trending up by a lot in the jet fueled side of things. And over time, as we continue to see the transition away from more fossil-based transportation fuels, we'll need a mix of different alternatives, and e-fuels is certainly an important part of that mix. I I'm excited for looking forward for the government to continue to do more and also look into what are the, additional incentives and market mechanisms that we can use and continue to be in dialogue with other states and different countries about how those might look, right? We recently got to chat with the EU on their e-fuels and how they're struggling to get production. So looking forward to continue to trade notes to see how do we ramp up production and, deploy.
Yes. DJ, real quick, final thoughts.
I always remember the Graduate movie with young Dustin Hoffman right at the end. Or so let me tell you about one word, just one. And at that time it was plastics. I would just call it e-fuels. And so I think that's a good final point to say.
I appreciate that. Chloe, you got the last word. Any wrap up thoughts here?
Yeah, thank you. Just last words maybe to be cautious, or a word of caution on the terms used for the different fuels. I did allude to that before, and e-fuels is a type of sustainable aviation fuel, but there are different types with different feedstocks. We have a very short glossary in the report, but just making that the difference between HEFA fuels and biofuels, and just the different feedstocks to produce the fuel that you're talking about, the type of sustainable aviation fuel that you're talking about, because they do have different environmental implications and long-term sustainability impacts in the world that we live in today. So that will be my last words. Thank you, Ethan.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chloe. Thank you all. The report again is called E-Fueling Flight, How to Increase In-State Production of Electrofuels for Aviation in California and Beyond. I want to thank the panelists here, Lillian Liu, Nick Pavlenko, and DJ Zaziski for joining us, as well as Chloe for her overview. Also want to thank our CLEE administrative team, Ellie Chanda and Maya Baltzley for their support for this webinar. I want to thank all of you as well for tuning in. We will have a recording of this webinar available afterwards. So do sign up on our CLEE mailing list to find out about when this one is out, if you missed anything, or other webinars that we have coming up as well and other events in the CLEE world. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and to our panelists again. And I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks so much.
Thank you.